All right, so I've been given the opportunity for a new role at a new company that will allow me to get away from reactive support and go back into proactive. So instead of being the guy that you call to fix stuff, I'll be the guy that calls the people to fix stuff, right? I've been doing containers, and so the next company will actually have me working on moving the app that they have currently in Azure VM to microservices, and then also implement DevOps as well. Now, I thought it might be interesting for some of you to join me on this ride as I try to catch back up on what it's like to being proactive, and then also as I walk the journey of adapting to the mindset of DevOps. All right, so to get this started, I used ChatGPT to help me write a very simple Python app. All it does is I can put my name in, put any name in, put a color in it, and this writes this to a SQL database that's also hosted in Azure. This whole entire thing is hosted on Azure VMs. It's a Windows server, and yeah, it's a Windows server. It's a simple Python app using Flask, I believe, and everything goes through managed identity into SQL. Let me show you what I wrote up to kind of make this a little easier. So the goal for all of this is going to be to kind of get an idea on how to architect container environments, and then also implement DevOps to use pipelines and so forth to actually deploy new versions and stuff into the application. So the idea is to migrate a single Python app from VM and SQL to microservices. We'll talk about which ones are possible and what would be a good option, and then also work on changing the deployment model to utilize DevOps. So here's kind of my current configuration. I do have it public, so you can actually go to the IP, and it'll go from the firewall using DNAT rules. Using DNAT rules, it goes to the private VM or private IP of the VM, and then from there, the app authenticates against SQL using managed identity. And so anytime you put anything into the web form, it just updates a very simple table in SQL. All right, so here's where things get funny, because at the end, I'm still human. I was going to show you guys the containerization options, right? And then I was going to go ahead and go through and sound smart with ACR versus Docker and show you the different options for SQL. But that's when I realized I'm doing this backwards. We don't want to go through and create the new AKS or the new containers, AKS, CI, whatever we're going to use, and migrate the data manually. We want to actually implement the DevOps processes, and once all that is in place and we're using pipelines and so forth to update the VM, then we can use it to go ahead and create a new environment and migrate everything over. So let's correct the project on what and show what we're going to do first. First, we've got to change the way we're thinking about the deployments, right? So we're going to change our mindset from the old traditional deployment models and adapt it to the more DevOps philosophies. And then once we have that in place, we can migrate the single Python app from VM and SQL to microservice containers, however that's going to look then. All right. So to jump right in, I think a good ending to this is just to go real quick over what DevOps even is. First thing, I think, and this is what took me some time to realize myself, DevOps is not just automation. It's a completely different mindset when it comes to how apps are updated, deployed, and same with the infrastructure, such as VMs, networks, etc. In the traditional model, you usually have a dev team that writes the code, and an ops team that manages the infrastructure. There's a wall between both teams, and app deployments are done via tickets, handovers, approvals, etc. So the app dev team writes the code, punts the deployment to the ops team to go ahead and deploy it, but both teams don't really know too well as to what each other is doing. In DevOps, that wall is lowered. It's not removed, but truly just lowered. Each team still has their own role, but there's a clear direction of who owns what, and that team does their own deployments and updates. There is some overlap as each team knows how the apps and infrastructure works, so they can properly troubleshoot and communicate when they do need to address something. But because dev owns the deployments for their own service, and because platform owns their own deployments for their infrastructure, it removes a lot of the handovers and a lot of the red tape that's involved with updating and deploying applications. But let me just tell you a story of what I'm used to on how the traditional model works. In the company I worked for, we had the app team or the dev team that wrote the code. Usually this was some sort of execution that had to be done in SQL. They would send this over to us to go ahead and deploy. I was on the ops team, I was handling servers, so they would send it over to us, and we had to go into SQL and push the code. But here was the deal. So they would ask us to go ahead and deploy this. This request needed to be approved by management. We then would push this into the first lower environment, which was dev. Once pushed, apps team would verify it was working, and this whole process repeated usually for another 2 or 3 lower environments, which could be done during regular business hours. It didn't affect customers. But for production, as this could cause downtime, we had to wait until after hours, usually late night, and then we'd have to have somebody available who could do the push, and so as to not to impact customers, right? If anything went wrong during that time period, troubleshooting was hard. The ops team didn't really know what the apps team was doing, didn't know what the code was doing. The apps team really didn't have good logging or access to see what was happening either. And then if they do need to roll back, it was usually fairly manual process of either fixing the code in SQL or maybe removing some components out of the application itself. So how does this work in a DevOps model? So in this case, the dev team writes the code and the dev team deploys the code. Within DevOps, especially in Azure, which is the one I'm familiar with, there are checks and tests written into the deployment to verify the functionality. So they don't have to hand over to us. There's no production downtime or anything as they're testing stuff. Things are just a lot quicker. If something breaks, the dev team is who owns the service. So they did the deployment, it failed. They can investigate to figure out why it's not working. In a perfect environment, they have access to the monitoring, the logging, and then be able to tell the platform team, if there is a platform issue, hey, this is what the problem is, can you address it? Since DevOps utilizes version control, rollback is simple as well. Oh, hey, this didn't work, let me just roll it back to the previous version, right? So usually downtime is a lot less as well. So what's the benefit here? So no longer does the dev team write the code and have the platform team deploy it one environment at a time. They can write the code, deploy it using pipelines or some sort of automation tool, and then as it goes through and checks in the lower environment, in each environment it goes through, and then when it goes into production, there's checks and tests to make sure it works as well. So there should not be downtime if done properly. Because of the CI/CD process within DevOps, there's versioning control. There are clear rollback plans. History, ownership of the deployment lies with the team that wrote it. Keep in mind, we're not just talking about apps team writing code for the individual apps. We're talking about the platform team writing templates to deploy new servers, clusters, network, whatever. Everything is a pipeline. Everything is a deployment now. Deployments are faster. They no longer need handovers between teams. Everything is automated. There can now be checks and verifications that are set up in the deployment process. And so they can be done live during the day and don't need to wait for night anymore. So things that could take sometimes a week or two to deploy can now be done usually within a couple of minutes or hours if you're using something like DevOps. So what is my plan for this series? Bear in mind, this is all going to be very fluid, right? I mean, this can change at any point, especially as I learn more and more about it. But I'm going to use Bicep and deploy my first platform piece. I'm going to go ahead and create a deployment to fully rebuild my current environment. I'll be the ops team, and I'll use AI, most likely ChatGPT, as my dev team. This isn't a production thing. This is just me goofing around, so I can have it write whatever code it wants. It doesn't have to be pretty, and I can have it fix whatever it needs to, right? And then, so I'll use it to go ahead and make changes to my app, do things like change background color and stuff. Nothing crazy. And deploy those changes using Azure DevOps and whatever tools are necessary to do this. The goal is to obviously learn best practices, but also just learn this new mindset, learn what it takes to go from this traditional deployment model to going more with DevOps. And then once the deployment is in the pipelines and we can do changes on a regular, then I'll work on migrating that environment into containers, fully utilizing the DevOps process. I'm learning as I'm doing this. Hopefully, as I'm learning, you're learning. And I'll keep my comments on as an open dialogue. And so if you're interested in something like this, please subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.